one new person. His wife only died 2.5 months ago. And he came to the group for the first time yesterday. And he said it was so helpful. He's definitely coming back and joining.
That's great. That's
Yeah.
really great. Well, again, it's one of the things that is going to be going on like normal during the summer, as we've mentioned. We'll remind people again at the end, we're going to be off the next couple of weeks. I'll be in Croatia and Israel, and with the time difference, it's just not going. We're not going to be able to do it. It's the morning class. We were trying to figure it out, how we could do it, but it's a 9-hour difference. Sometimes I've been to England, and we did it actually last year. We did the class. One of the classes we did in the middle of the night. I kind of got in trouble for doing it, but I didn't get in a lot of trouble, but I did it. I did push it. It was like 5 or 6 o'clock in the morning, or 3 or 4. I don't remember, but so this is 9 hours. Israel is 10 hours. England is 8 hours. This is kind of in the middle in Croatia. And then in Israel, it'll be 10 hours. And that's a tough one too. So, because 10 hours from now would be 5 o'clock in the morning to start. And it's interesting because when I was at Tracy's family's house last summer, when we were in England for a week or so, I could find a nice quiet part of the house to do the class and wasn't waking anybody, or I didn't think I was waking anybody. Maybe I did. It was fine. But in a hotel room with my wife at 5 o'clock in the morning, she's not going to be happy. Anyways, it's not
we can be patient.
I know it's not a big problem, but I feel like when we're doing this class, the classes where we're reading one week after another, I don't like to take people out of it. It's like a TV show that you don't want to break and come back and forget the characters.
But it's all about making the wife happy.
What?
It's all about making the wife happy.
Yeah, Mike happy.
Where are you? Are you not in Europe right now?
No. So I'm out of town, not in Europe, but I'm going to be. We're taking care of a lot of stuff this weekend. We're doing a lot of the work that I can't do when I'm gone. I am doing some work in Israel. I think John, I talked to John and Gloria about it because they actually were there 5 years ago. I'm going to be there for the Maccabea games. JLTV used to broadcast the Maccabea games, and we're not this year. It's a logistical nightmare, and we never made any money broadcasting the games, and it was, like we broadcast some of them, and I can't broadcast everything anyways, but we always did the opening and closing ceremonies, and then this year we were going to do the closing ceremonies. And I'm going to be there for the closing ceremonies, but it was just too hard to do. And then interestingly, the costs to do it actually for us went up. So, but it really is a special time of year when the people come for the Jewish Olympics essentially, and John and Gloria's kids actually. They actually participated as athletes in the Maccabea games, which is, I think, a great thing to be able to say you've done in life. But just to see it, and just to see Jews from all around the world, it reminds. I mean, you see that in Israel all the time, but during the Maccabea, you'll see literally Jews from Mongolia and Jews from places you've never even heard of. But yeah, you see that in Israel all the time, but during the Maccabea games, that's front and center. I will tell you this, the hotel is costing us more than ever because the hotels are more hotel rooms are booked up because of the Maccabea events. And also there's, birthrights going on again, which is great. The birthright trips are back in Israel, and so are just the normal tourism is really it's starting to pick up, which is great. So we're looking forward to going with our community in February again. And we've already got, the trip is happening. We already are over the threshold of how many participants we need to guarantee it. So I'm excited about it. And we have a great guide that's taking us around, and hopefully everything will continue to be good in Israel. And I will tell people who are on right now, because we do have, I will tell people one of the things, and I shouldn't even say this, but in the coming weeks, sometime in the coming weeks, we're going to have a very special interview on JLTV that will probably give us a huge amount of publicity that will be both positive and negative. But it's already been done. The interview's it's already in the can, as they say. And I haven't seen it, but I know the file is being uploaded for me to be able to see today or tomorrow. Probably see it tomorrow. There's a special interview about the Abraham Accords. So do you want to guess who the interview is with? Anybody?
The
President
kid.
Trump.
Uh-huh. So the interview's been done. John Voight and one of our other staff people did the interview last week, one Tuesday, about a week ago. So it's not been fully, it's not even been, it's a very raw edit that I'm going to see, but hopefully I'm just actually asking right now whether I'm going to see it today. So we'll see. I think it'll be up. We'll be airing it pretty soon. So yeah, I think people are going to hear about it. They're going to know about it, and we're going to probably get yeah. So you're the first people to know that this is going to be happening.
Do I need to arrange a security detail for you?
Perhaps there's a chance. So yeah. I will tell you this. There was a discussion ahead of time that the interview had to focus on the Abraham Accords and only on the Abraham Accords. And the president did not adhere to that. So it's going to be edited a little bit, but that was the purpose of it. And for that, the argument was, how can you deny that that's an important interview and discussion to have? So I think it's the third anniversary, I think the third anniversary of the Accord. So anyways, we'll see. Yes. We'll see if I need a security detail. I wasn't responsible for it. I didn't arrange it. I hope it is informative, and I hope it helps our prestige of our network. So let's see what happens. I had nothing to do with organizing it, so I can take no credit or responsibility for it. I will also tell you, and I think I told some people already, we're also going to be airing Zelensky's comedy called Servant of the People. We'll be the first network to air that, but that's starting in September. So it's 50 episodes, and we got the first rights to air it in America. It's on Netflix already, so I'm probably hurting our ratings by telling people it's actually available. Nobody knows it's available on Netflix, and it is subtitled, so it is, takes a little bit of attention that you have to watch it with subtitles. But I think I haven't seen all the episodes, but it's pretty well done. It's not like some foreign television shows or movies that are difficult to watch. This is actually pretty well done, pretty well produced. So anyways, those are some things coming up that we are working on. So we left off last week in chapter 7. We read I kind of couldn't stop, and I read a little bit into chapter 7 because, as I told you last week, we are in the midst of the confrontation between Moses and Aaron versus Pharaoh. So we forget, because the movies kind of cut out Aaron, that Aaron is really front and center in the confrontation, that he's with Moses the whole time, or virtually the whole time. I will tell you, sometimes we don't see Aaron, but most of the time we do. And what was interesting is that we pointed out last week that all throughout it says, Moses and Aaron. And what we had last week was this weird kind of digression or review or flashback to Moses's family. We never had heard about Moses's family, really, the genealogy, until chapter 6. So we read about Moses's birth in chapter 2, and then, again, to review, we had the burning bush, we had Moses going back to Egypt, and then we had, and as we pointed out, maybe two different authors, or really three different authors, presenting the initial confrontation between Moses and Aaron versus Pharaoh. And so that's chapter 6. And then in chapter 7, we come back to this, and what it seems, and again, this is maybe primarily because some people say there's a different author, there is this idea here now presented that when Moses and Aaron are speaking to, I'll try to say Aaron every time, when Moses and Aaron speak to Pharaoh, God tells them right away, and this is what we left out with, this is where the last line we read, is this famous line that we have, I will harden Pharaoh's heart that I may multiply my signs and marvels in the land of Egypt. And so this week, we're going to actually specifically get into those plagues. And as I kind of left off last time, it's because, again, the Torah wants to tell us that those plagues, to some extent, were set in motion and were foretold, predestined, before they even happen. Even to the extent that we read that that the firstborn are going to be killed. And that is, that's kind of weird for people to think about, because, well, it gets to the question of predestination or predetermination. Are these things, is everything predetermined? Is everything predestined? Or again, is it just a specific situation where it doesn't seem like Pharaoh really has free will? And is that, in essence, not fair to Pharaoh, that he doesn't really have a choice in the matter, that even if he wanted to, he's not going to be allowed to change his mind and let the Israelites go. So all of this seems a little bit difficult, because even if it's just Pharaoh, here we have a person in the Bible, a person that we read about, that God doesn't let make a decision. Which, again, if that's the case for Pharaoh, is that the case for anybody else? So, that's the I just got a text back. They're just starting the editing process of the Trump interview. But I asked them to send it to me ASAP. I don't want to see the edit. I actually don't want to see the edited version. Oh, I want to see the raw. Let's see the raw version first. Anyways, so if God can do this for Pharaoh, can God do that for other people too? Or does God do that to other people? Not let them change their mind, harden their heart, or other people's hearts hardened by God. And that, that becomes a theological issue that people wrestle with. And it kind of asks that question, because if it did happen, can it happen again? Or is this a unique situation?
Are
So
those words used anywhere else in the Bible?
Um,
that God set up something?
that's a good question. I don't think this phrase, no. You're going to see a few different phrases used actually. To harden the heart is actually, so in Hebrew, the word is akshet lev. And again, lev means heart, but obviously as we know, in other places where the word lev is used, it's also the mind. It's
Well,
not,
what it says is he won't let him change his mind. Does
Yeah.
does he ever say anything like that? God won't let him change his mind.
no, it's not. And as I said, there's another
Because I
version
don't
of this.
remember that.
There's another version of it coming, another version of hardening the heart. So yeah, it doesn't seem like there's other biblical cases where God basically doesn't allow for, that basically God makes somebody do this.
Mhm.
You know, it's difficult to say whether the intention was to explain what had happened during the Exodus by basically saying, well, Pharaoh he couldn't change his mind. Now, you might ask yourselves, why do we have that? And if you think about it, there's a logical question which people might have asked, even as the people were telling this story in an oral tradition before it was ever written down, which is, why didn't Pharaoh change his mind? Like, after how many plagues and after how many times that Pharaoh is getting hit and the Egyptians are getting hit, did they not stop? So whatever the reality was, some people say, well, the plagues are explanations for scientific events that happened. Other people say, no, there were actual plagues that were miracles, supernatural events. Then the question is, did Pharaoh really need 10? And as we mentioned last week, and we'll put it out there again when we finish the plagues, nowhere does it actually say there's 10 plagues. But even if there's 4 plagues, even if there's one author there's 3, and one author there's 7, it doesn't really matter. It still asks the question, did Pharaoh really need that many things in order to finally let the people go? And it kind of already said, I'm going to kill their firstborn and then they're going to let us go. We read that already. So the Torah might be giving us an answer to the question of, why does Pharaoh not ever deviate from this? It doesn't seem to make sense. And so they literally say that's because God didn't let him. There was no, he couldn't. And you could say that's the only rational explanation, is that when somebody does something that defies logic, defies common sense, defies any type of reason, that God must have done that, because that in itself becomes a supernatural act, because a human being wouldn't go through these experiences and not do anything. So, I mean, keep it in mind as you read it, maybe as you read the plagues with a fresh eye, maybe you'll see it in a different way. But this line, and this is why I got to it last week, talking about it still, this line happens before any of the plagues hit the Egyptians. So the Egyptians haven't been hit with anything yet. And we as readers, and we as hearers of the story, human being wrote, whatever, this was set up before the plagues hit. So just keep that in mind. This line didn't happen after the 4th plague or 5th plague, where then God says, oh, and you know why he can't change his mind? Because I did this. No, God says this before any one of even the 1st plague happens. All right, so when Pharaoh does not heed you, I will lay my hand upon Egypt and deliver my ranks, my people, the Israelites, from the land of Egypt with extraordinary chastisements. And again, it doesn't say 10, it says extraordinary chastisements. And the Egyptians shall know I am Adonai, when I stretch out my hand over Egypt and bring out the Israelites from their midst. This Moses and Aaron did as Adonai had commanded them, so they did. And here it says, Moses was 80 years old and Aaron was 83 when they made their demand on Pharaoh. And Adonai said to Moses and Pharaoh, When Pharaoh speaks to you, produce your marvel. You shall say to Aaron, take your rod and cast it down before Pharaoh. It shall turn into a serpent. So we all remember this scene from the Ten
Mhm.
Commandments movie. We remember it from Prince of Egypt. It's one of the first Bible stories that probably some of us, at least in my case, I remember hearing. So Moses and Aaron came before Pharaoh and did just as Adonai had commanded. Aaron cast down his rod in the presence of Pharaoh and his courtiers, and it turned into a serpent. Okay, so the story actually says that Aaron did it. Moses told him what to do, and Aaron did it. So it doesn't say it's Moses's rod. It says your rod, and it says that Aaron cast down his rod in the presence of Pharaoh. So they all see it turn into a serpent. Everybody sees it, not just Pharaoh, not just Moses and Aaron and Pharaoh, but all the courtiers saw it. Then Pharaoh, for his part, summoned the sages and the sorcerers and the Egyptian magician priests. And the word there is the Hartume Mitzrayim, which they translate as magician priests because it seems to be not the word that we use for priest, which is a Kohen. And we use that word for other peoples, like Midianites have Kohanim, right? Yitro is a Kohen. This is a Hartume. This is a specific kind of wizard. It is somebody who does maybe religious type witchcraft, magic. But this is a well-known caste of people in Egypt that could do these kinds of things. And it says that they did the same thing with their spells. Each cast down his rod and they turn into serpents. But Aaron's rods swallowed their rods. So they did do this miracle themselves. However they did it. And it says they did it with their spells. So this is a supernatural event that's replicated. It's replicated by the Egyptians with magic. But of course, the one that God did swallowed the other rod. So that's pretty impressive, right? That all the other snakes got swallowed up by the rod that Aaron had thrown down. And here's the word. Pharaoh's heart stiffened, and he did not heed them as Adonai had said. So the word here is vayechazek lev, which is a different word than kasheh, which means to harden, which is why they used a different word, stiffened. The word chazak, right? This is the verb, stiffened. God stiffened his heart. This word chazak is the word we use for strength. When we say chazak, v'nit chazek, be strong, let us be strengthened. The word chazak usually means strength. Stiffened is not a horrible translation, but it really has this idea that, and I think it's kind of conveyed in the word stiffened, but that Pharaoh's mind was already made up.
Mhm.
But God hardened it or stiffened it or strengthened that determination not to listen. So, Moses and Aaron do their stuff, and then he just gets more mad. He just gets more defiant, Pharaoh. And of course, it finishes with the words, because we already read it, that God said this was going to happen. So Moses and Aaron, to some extent, have been warned, so they don't feel, maybe now they won't be despondent. They won't walk away like Moses did last time after his first meeting with Pharaoh, feeling like he screwed up. They've gone backwards. Now, again, God has said, it's not going to go well. It's not going to be good, but it's okay. So I told you that. So that's the first confrontation, the first magic and wonders that Moses and Aaron do for Pharaoh. It's the serpent. Nobody gets hurt. It's a show, but Pharaoh's not impressed. His own people did a version of the magic. All those things are there. And again, God stiffened his heart. strengthen his heart, strengthen his determination. And maybe translate it like that. But that's the intent. And the Lord spoke to Moses. Pharaoh is stubborn. He refuses to let the people go. Go to Pharaoh in the morning as he is coming out of the water, and station yourself before him at the edge of the Nile, taking with you the rod that turned into the snake. And say to him, Adonai, the God of the Hebrews, sent me to you to say, let my people go, that they may worship me in the wilderness. But you have paid no heed until now. So this goes back to the version or the way of saying, let my people go so that we can worship me in the wilderness. Not let my people go so that they'll leave and never come back.
Mhm.
But let them go. And the assumption here is we'll go pray and we'll be back. Now, this is what God is telling him to do. Go to Pharaoh in the morning as he's coming out of the water, right? Which also implies here that Pharaoh is either bathing or relieving himself or doing something in a more private way than he was the last time they met. You can see the rod is here in the story. Take that with. Of course, this is Moses returning to the scene of where he was found as a baby,
Mhm.
the edge of the Nile. So this is a pretty powerful thing for Moses to come back to, maybe the same place where, the Pharaoh's daughter saw him, the Pharaoh's private beach off the Nile.
Mhm.
That's a pretty ironic, coincidental, whatever you want to say. It's a pretty meaningful spot for Moses to come back to this place now, again, as the advocate, as the leader of the Jewish people, to the place where Pharaoh and the family essentially has their private moments, if you will, and he's now invaded their space. Yep. So, thus says the Lord, by this you shall know I'm Adonai. See, I shall strike the water in the Nile with the rod that is in my hand, and it will be turned to blood, and the fish in the Nile will die. The Nile will stink so that the Egyptians will find it impossible to drink the water of the Nile. And Adonai said to Moses, say to Aaron, take your rod and hold out your arms over the waters of Egypt, its rivers, its canals, its ponds, and all its bodies of water, that they will turn to blood. There shall be blood throughout the land of Egypt, even in the vessels of wood and stone. So, look, in the first place, it says that this is going to be the Nile. Here, it goes further to say
Mhm.
that it's all the waters. So again, the water all kind of comes from the Nile, but it also here says it's canals, it's ponds, it's all the bodies of water will be turned to blood. And even the water that was taken out of the Nile and put in wood and stone, for people to have their water supply. Remember, before they didn't have, running water, they had to fetch water and bring it back, and they'd have water jugs and wells in their homes. All of that is also going to be turned to blood. It's pretty serious to be hit in the water supply. And Moses and Aaron did just as Adonai commanded. He lifted up the rod and struck the water in the Nile in the sight of Pharaoh and here it says, and his courtiers. So it does say, even in this space, other people saw this happen. So if it was supposed to be a private moment, it wasn't, because other people saw this. And it is important to look at these things. Who's involved in the plague? Moses and Aaron. Who brings it on? Who does sees it, whether it's Pharaoh and the courtiers, and who it affects, and also where it comes from. In this case, of course, it comes from the water. All the water of the Nile was turned into blood. And the fish in the Nile died. The Nile stank so that the Egyptians could not drink water from the Nile. And there was blood throughout the land of Egypt. But when the Egyptian magician priests did the same with their spells, Pharaoh's heart stiffened and he did not heed them as Adonai had spoken. And this is the last thing you have to keep in mind. The plagues are also for Pharaoh's conscience and knowledge are replicated by the Egyptian magicians. So this is the last piece of, well, it's not the last piece, but like if you're going through a checklist of saying each plague, what happens? Where does it happen? Who initiates it? Who sees it? Who's it done in front of? And then where did the plague come from? You can also add, was it replicated? And you can also add, is this language there? Pharaoh's heart stiffened and he did not heed them as Adonai had spoken. So these magicians are able to replicate this plague, and Pharaoh is not impressed. He's not impressed because he knows, oh, that can be done. It can be done. By the way, there's another thing to look at. There's one more thing if we're evaluating each plague. Who does it affect, right? Does this plague, in essence, also affect the Israelites? Does it affect everybody who lives in Egypt? And it seems like it does. It seems like everybody who lives there is going to be affected by it. It seems that way, right? Because it says it was throughout the land of Egypt. That's what it says. There was blood throughout the land of Egypt. So do Israelites get affected by it? Pharaoh turned and went into his palace, paying no regard even to this. And all the Egyptians had to dig round about the Nile for drinking water because they could not drink the water of the Nile. And when 7 days had passed after Adonai had struck the Nile, Adonai said to Moses, go to Pharaoh and say to him, thus says Adonai, let my people go that they may worship me. Which is another thing that we see sometimes after the plagues is God telling Moses to go back to Pharaoh and say, now let them worship me. Is there that direction at the end of it? So, you know, part of this plague seems to be, and again, I don't think it's much of a speculation or interpretation to say that when the Nile got hit and people said, well, if we can dig water from an aquifer or get it from somewhere else, and it's not the Nile, then the plague was crazy, because while the magicians might have been able to do something like making blood come out of the water, what happens is it's not specific to just the water that was being taken out of the Nile at the time. It says that anywhere where there was Nile water, it turned to blood. So if somebody had taken water out of the Nile and filled it up in their stones, then at that point, that water turned to blood too, which that doesn't seem like it was just a plague against water, but specifically the Nile water, which really is also saying specifically the plague hit the Nile, which was the Egyptian life force. It was the Egyptian god. The god of the Nile was worshipped by the Egyptians as a deity in its own right. So this is actually, as much as it is a plague on the infrastructure of the Egyptians, it's actually also a theological occurrence, in that the Nile, by bleeding, it's essentially like saying their god is bleeding. The Nile god Sobek is literally being assaulted by our God. Our God is killing their God. And there was that sense that this is a theological battle as well. And of course, the irony is the Egyptians can replicate this, and that makes Pharaoh feel confident that he doesn't need to listen. But it's not, there's more to this than just the water turned red. It's that it was like the Nile was bleeding, which was, pretty awesome and pretty scary and very powerfully significant religiously for these people. And then God says to Moses to tell Pharaoh, not just that they have to go, but here now it says, if you refuse to let them go, then I will plague your whole country with frogs. The Nile shall swarm with frogs, and they shall come up and enter your palace, your bedchamber, and your bed, the houses of your courtiers and your people, and your ovens and your kneading bowls. The frogs shall come upon you and your people and all your courtiers. So here's the plague of frogs. What's interesting about this plague, as opposed to the previous plague, is that there's actually now a warning for what's going to happen. Pharaoh is actually told, if you don't listen, this is what the next thing is. And part of this, of course, is to show that this isn't Moses coming after the fact saying, hey, you know what just happened to you? That was God. Now the Egyptians have been specifically warned what will happen. They've been told ahead of time what will happen in very descriptive ways. And let's see what the second plague looks like. And again, a lot of people point out, well, the water turned to blood. The frogs live in the water. Of course, they're going to come out of the water. They don't have anywhere to live. That's where the chapter break is. It makes sense, but the next verse literally is, and Adonai said to Moses, say to Aaron, hold out your arm with the rod over the rivers, the canals, the ponds, and bring up the frogs on the land of Egypt. So no question it comes out of the water. That's the place where the miracle is manifested. Aaron is there too. There's the rod. Those themes are there. Obviously, I'm talking about this because people look at this. They look at whether these plagues can be identified by a source, who wrote them, by what things we see in them. But most importantly, again, as we read this, there's a warning this time, specifically what's going to happen. And I think it's also critical to see, well, let's see what happens here. Aaron held out his arm over the waters, and the frogs came up and covered the land of Egypt. But the magician priests did the same with their spells and brought frogs upon the land of Egypt. So some people forget the serpents got done by the Hartume, the magicians. The blood in the Nile done by the Egyptians. And then the frogs come out by the magicians. Plague also, as you said, we said Aaron is very much involved in this. I will point out, just because the midrash on this is so miraculous or visual, if you will. But we do need to say one thing about the frogs. Well, we could say a lot about the frogs, but the words here say, and Aaron held out his arms over the waters of Egypt, and it says Hatzfardea. It literally says the frog came out of the frog came up and covered the land of Egypt. So the rabbis actually said that initially only one frog comes up. So when the first frog comes up, the Pharaoh kind of laughs And then um, and I mean, it's a little confusing because why does it not say Sfardaim? See, there, we start Sfardea and we go Dam Sfardea, right? Here it says Sfardaim, it says frogs, it says the plural. So we know there's a plural word for it. It's not like deer, like it's plural or singular. Frogs, there is a plural for it. So why is it one frog? So this image of the one frog coming up and then all the other frog, like Pharaoh laughs at the frog and then all the other frogs come up. But there's another possibility that this one frog comes up. It's a huge frog and then it busts up into several million other little frogs. So that's another possibility based on the Sfardea coming up by itself, that only one frog came up, but it was a massive frog. Or there was one frog, he laughed and then the rest of the frogs come up. There's another possibility here too, which is that the Egyptians are actually compounding the miracles themselves. It says that they replicate them, right? But in a sense, what's happening in the first cases is that Pharaoh sees his magicians do them. He dismisses them as common magic or magic that his own people can do. So even if it's not common magic, he's not impressed by it because his own people can do that. But there's also this kind of humor to it, which is, well, they're just making more problems. They're replicating more problem. And do they actually add to this problem by, essentially multiplying it exponentially the effect of what the plague would have been because they're replicating it too. So I don't know if it's meant to be that way or meant to be humorous, but do the Egyptians actually make it worse by replicating it, by doing it themselves? So, because it does say, and they brought frogs upon the land of Egypt too. So it can't be good to have more frogs. They already have frogs and he put more, and the Egyptians now just put more frogs into the equation. There's more frogs. So they actually, I think it's humorous, but I don't know. I mean, I don't know that it was meant to be humorous, but there was a certain kind of like dark humor to the fact that the Egyptians just made the problem worse. So after this plague, it says, Pharaoh summoned Moses and Aaron and said, plead with Adonai to remove the frogs from me and my people, and I will let your people go to sacrifice to Adonai. And Moses said to Pharaoh, you may have this triumph over me, for what time shall I plead in behalf of you and your courtiers and your people, that the frogs be cut off from you and your houses to remain only in the Nile? For tomorrow, he replied. And Moses said, as you say, that you may know that there is none like our God Adonai. I'll finish this sentence. The frog shall retreat from you and your courtiers and your people. They shall remain only in the Nile. So we'll get rid of I'll get rid of them. But let me ask you a question, Pharaoh. How quickly do I have to get rid of them for you to be impressed with it? This is a miracle. And he says, you got to do it by tomorrow. So if I get them ready by tomorrow, if I get rid of them and they're all back in the Nile by tomorrow, by the way, it doesn't say that all of them were killed. It says that they all have to stay in the Nile from now on. I'm only going to say that because you'll see what we mean in a second. But what's interesting about this and what people forget is that after the second plague, Pharaoh says, I give up. He said that. I don't like the triumph over me, because that's not, the key here is not that you beat me. It's that essentially, if I'm going to intercede on your behalf, what will impress you with how quickly I can get rid of these frogs from you? And so that's when Pharaoh says, you got to do it by tomorrow. Otherwise, it's not such a big miracle. So, it literally says he calls him back. Pharaoh summoned them. So that is also part of what we see after the plagues. He didn't call them back after the first time. Moses came back to him and said, you're going to get hit by another plague tomorrow, or not tomorrow, your next plague is the frogs. Here he calls him for the next meeting. So, and to some extent, Pharaoh is already giving up. And the remittance or the end of this plague is going to be quick. And that is going to prove to Pharaoh too, that this is God's actions, that this is what, this is God, and this is the God that is like no other God. There's none like God. He ain ka Adonai Eloheinu. There's no one like our God Adonai. And so here's what it says. Moses and Aaron left Pharaoh's presence, and Moses cried out to Adonai in the matter of the frogs, which had been inflicted upon Pharaoh. And Adonai did as Moses asked. The frogs died out in the houses, the courtyards, and the fields. And they piled them up in heaps till the land stank. But when Pharaoh saw there was relief, he became stubborn and would not heed them as Adonai had spoken. So, well, we know that there's going to be more plagues because we all know it. But we also know it because the Bible told us that there are going to be more plagues. So there's no surprise at this point that Pharaoh changed his mind. So it does say that the frogs are going to stay in the Nile, but the ones that had come out of the Nile are now dying. And they're dying, and they are literally causing an environmental nightmare because they are dying everywhere, in the homes, in the outside, in the backyard, out in their fields. This is causing a massive cleanup. And what are you going to do with them? So they had to dispose of all these frogs that had come out. So the ones that came out, they're not coming back into the Nile. It's not like they all return. The ones that for the future will stay in the Nile. There'll still be frogs in the Nile, but those ones that came out are going to die and they're going to stink. And that's what it says. The land stank. So this is an ancillary plague, which is foul stench over Egypt after this. This most beautiful of countries where, again, technologically advanced, no country was as advanced and as beautiful at the time as Egypt. It's filled with dead frogs. And again, the phrase here is different. So now we've had hardened, made hard, kashet, chazak, which is stiffened or strengthened. And here we have a third word used. Hachbed et libo. Kabed et libo. The word kabed means to, well, the reason they translate it as stubborn, kabed has a sense of to make heavy. So stubborn is not a bad translation because the intent of it is definitely to say that somebody has they've strengthened or gotten heavier in their position. The word kabed, we know, is honor, right? When we say honor your father and mother, the word has as its root a sense of heaviness. It's also used for the word for glory. The glory of God is called the kavod. We also use that word to describe honor and gravitas for people, which also has that connotation of weight and of power, is gravitas. That kaved means heaviness. It's a sense of weight. It's a sense of denseness, if you will. That there's a force behind it. All of those have those are all part of this word, which is why this stubborn is not a bad it's not a bad word for this in this place, because again, it's almost like Pharaoh becomes unmovable. His heart becomes unmovable. So that's another word that we've had. So we've had 3 different words used for this. Interesting thing too about the word kavod or kibed, that root is also the word for our liver in Hebrew, which is a very dense and heavy organ, and is the ancients saw it as and they understood some of what the liver did, but they understood it to be kind of the part of what filters and has different peoples, including the Egyptians, felt that to some extent that was the root of our essence to some extent too, in the liver, that some of our essence of who we are, our soul, is there too. So I mean, that's just another connection to that root in Hebrew. So it's the 3rd word we have here. And again, so here Pharaoh changes his mind. In the previous plague with blood, Pharaoh didn't change his mind. Pharaoh was like, so what? This time Pharaoh said, yeah, let him go. And then he doesn't do it. So this is the first time now that Pharaoh said no. I said yes in my mind. I maybe told you I said yes, but no, I'm not going to do it. So this is Pharaoh now officially going back on his word. He didn't do that the first time. He did it now. And of course, that means he's going to do it again. And he's going to do it again. But he didn't do it the first time. He did it the second time. Just again, keep all this in mind as we read this. Then Adonai said to Moses, say to Aaron, hold out your rod and strike the dust of the earth. So we have the rod, we have Aaron again. Strike the dust of the earth, and it shall turn to lice throughout the land of Egypt. This is the 3rd plague. This plague emanates from the earth. First 2 plagues the water. This plague is the earth. Interesting, right? And here the earth is turning to lice. So now we don't just have water turning to blood, or frogs coming out of the water. Now we have something on the earth turning into something else. Now, people who say, well, maybe the water of the Nile wasn't really blood. Maybe there was some kind of sediment or some type of algae in the water that was there and that Moses stirred it up. The frogs responded to this. This plague is really very interesting because in this case, it says specifically that the dust is going to turn to lice. And this seems to be turning something out of something else, but completely changing its essence from something that was dead to something that's actually, a creature. Lice is it's a living organism. Again, you could argue the lice was there in the earth and Moses brought it up or whatever, but this seems to be pretty different in some ways. Why would we even say that? Because there's an interesting midrash, an explanation that we've had for centuries, and it's one that maybe even you thought in the back of your mind when we read about the plague of blood. There's an interesting midrash that the blood of the Nile was actually the blood from the babies of the Israelites that was there essentially ever since those Jewish boys were thrown into the Nile. That blood was there all along, and it was retribution And the blood itself, kind of like comes out of the Nile as punishment for what happened there in the Nile, which is fairly poetic justice, if you will. It's very powerful to think of that. But this lice coming out of the earth is something that the Egyptians aren't really going to be able to make sense of. And it now says that not only is the water coming against you, but the earth is coming against you as well. And that's important to see where it manifests. And they did so. Oh, by the way, too, there is no warning here for the second plague. I mean, for the third plague. At the end of the second plague, at the end of the first plague, Moses told Pharaoh, "You're going to get frogs." Moses doesn't, and Moses and Aaron don't tell Pharaoh, "Hey, you're going to get hit with this." Aaron held out his arm with the rod and struck the dust of the earth, and vermin came up upon human and beast, and all the dust of the earth turned into lice throughout the land of Egypt. The magician priests did the lice with their spells to produce lice, but they could not. The vermin remained upon human and beast. And the magician priest said to Pharaoh, "This is the finger of God." But Pharaoh's heart stiffened, and he would not heed them, as Adonai had spoken. So, third plague. Now tick off another thing. The priests can't manifest this. So the first two plagues they could, plus the serpents. So if you want to say three things they could do, the fourth one they couldn't. You can look at it either way. I mean, I tend to look at it that the Egyptian priests do the first three things. The first one not being a plague in itself. By the way, that's only if we have in our minds that there are 10 plagues. If you think of the plagues differently, then as wonders and as signs, which is what it says initially, at least in one possible way of telling the narrative, the first wonder is turning the staff into the snakes, and then the plagues manifest itself afterwards. Obviously, that's kind of why I set it up the way we're reading it today, because these are all part of the confrontations, and it also is part of what we see in the story, that the first few times the Egyptian priests can do it, but by the third plague or the fourth step, can't do it anymore. They can't do it. And they go to the Pharaoh and say, "This is God." And they don't say this is Adonai. It says, "This is God. Etzba Elohim." This is the finger of God, which kind of makes sense that they would say that, because they don't call God Yud He Vav He. They don't use the word Lord. They say, "This is God, though. This is the God. This is a God. This is God. This isn't magic anymore." And that's what they said. This is the finger of God. And it doesn't matter, because what we now see is that Pharaoh didn't care whether his magicians could do it, either because God wouldn't let him, or God makes his heart stiffen. It was already going to do it, but God makes him determined not to do it. But that's the way I usually translate it. I've kind of given away my theology on this, which is that Pharaoh was determined to do what he was going to do, and God just made sure that he did it, which is a little different than God changed his mind and wouldn't let him do it. The guy didn't want to do it. And that voice in the back of his head that should have said, "You know what, Pharaoh, you're making a big mistake." That voice, he doesn't listen to it, because God doesn't let him listen to it. Whatever extra energy that he needed to do, that's where, and again, I would say, because people read this and go, how does Pharaoh not do the right thing at some stage, any stage? It's essentially that God wouldn't let him do it. And that's the phrase. Whatever phrase is, stiffened, hardened, stubborn, made stubborn. It's got to be divine. There had to be a divine role in it, because how else would somebody not see the light? And Adonai said to Moses, early in the morning, present yourself to Pharaoh as he is coming out of the water, and say to him, thus says Adonai, let my people go that they may worship me. For if you do not let my people go, I will let loose swarms of insects against you and your courtiers, and your people, and your houses, the houses of the Egyptians, and the very ground they stand on shall be filled with swarms of insects. Now, this plague, there's going to be a warning back to it. Okay, so the fourth plague that we're about to hit with is, there's a warning. And this is the plague we say, arov. So again, Pharaoh's warned, this is what's going to happen. It's going to hit you, these swarms. And again, come to him when he's coming out of the water. Again, I'll put to you the fact that there are people who say that this is Moses coming to Pharaoh during his private time. I'm not saying that this is the only possibility, but it would be as if Moses came and confronted the big boss of Egypt when he was in the bathroom. I'm not saying that that's the situation, because now if I put that in your mind, you have somebody in a corporate office setting going and confronting the boss of the company in a building. And of course, this says, he's at the Nile in his more of his home place. So maybe it's even coming to the boss at his house and bothering him in his house. But the possibility of him coming to Pharaoh while Pharaoh is relieving himself is a possibility. So either bathing or going to the bathroom. So there's a warning. And now look at the last part of the warning. But on that day I will set apart the region of Goshen where my people dwell, so that no swarms of insects shall be there, that you may know that I, Adonai, am in the midst of the land. And I will make a distinction between my people and your people. Tomorrow this sign shall come to pass. So here, as we talked about way back a few weeks ago when we talked about Goshen, here it seems as the Israelites were still living in Goshen, in a special part of Egypt, in a different part of Egypt, not by the Nile. So again, maybe Moses lived in an area where it's difficult to know why, other than an authorship issue where, again, one author sees the Egyptians and the Israelites living in the same towns mixed up together, or this version where the Israelites are normally living in the land of Goshen, Moses maybe being the exception. The idea that Moses was raised there by the Nile in the main city of Egypt. It might have been a different strand, a different tradition. All we know is that it's not until the fourth plague that we have this distinction, which means the first three plagues, essentially, the way this has been laid out, hit Israelites too. Blood, the frogs, and the lice. It doesn't ever say that Israelites were not affected by it. On the contrary, here, the fourth time, it says that God is going to set them apart and it's not going to affect them. That's what it said. So this is now part of, again, when we evaluate the plagues, who's doing them, where they're coming from, etc. Now, and whether the Egyptian magicians can do them, here we have a new distinction or something we can actually point to and say, No, these plagues don't affect the Israelites. It's the first time we've seen this, though. And it says, on that day, I will set apart the region of Goshen, which means that, like, up until then, there was no distinction. And you can make the argument that the first three plagues were not life and death plagues. They didn't last that long. They're more inconveniences than the rest of the plagues are going to be. But this plague is going to make a distinction. And that in itself now is going to be part of the miracle. The fact that it will not affect the Israelites. But it's not until the fourth plague, Arov. There is a warning, and the warning maybe is significant because now Moses is telling Pharaoh, watch what happens now. Israelites are not going to be affected. And that's going to be even more miraculous. And Adonai did so. Heavy swarms of insects invaded Pharaoh's palace and the houses of his courtiers. Throughout the country of Egypt, the land was ruined because of the swarms of insects. And Pharaoh summoned Moses and Aaron, said, go and sacrifice to your God within the land. So now Pharaoh comes back and says, and summons them and says, I'm not going to let them go, but you can worship your God, but you have to do it here. So Pharaoh seems to have relented again, is going to let them do something for themselves, for God. I will tell you this. And nowhere does it say the word insects. Mary, do you have your King James open?
I do. It says flies.
Interesting. Well, so there it actually gives the word flies. I will tell you this. The word that's used is arov over and over again, which literally means swarms. Okay. So when we look at commentary on this, let's see what it says. Let's see what Rashi says. Let's see. Yeah. Arov means all kinds of wild beasts, serpents, and scorpions, a mixture, arov, of noxious creatures in a crowd. These played havoc with them. This is a reason given in the Midrash, in the case of each plague, why this particular one and why that. God came against them with the tactics of warlike operations that's carried out by kings in an orderly sequence. A government monarch who is besieging a city first destroys its water supply, then they blow trumpets and sound an alarm in order to terrify and dismay them, and thus their water supply was turned into blood. The frogs croaked, made a noise, and well, that's a second issue, which is, according to Rashi, if you follow the law, the art of war, there's military tactics that countries, when they go to war against each other, when a king goes to war against a country, these are the things that he does. He cuts off the water supply. Check, turns makes noise with trumpets. Well, that's what the frogs did. Check. So Rashi goes through, and remember, he lives in the Middle Ages. He lives in 11th century France. He knew what military tactics were like in his day too. These are what people did, and they had been doing it for thousands of years. So he's basically saying God is like a general, a monarch going to war, and he's going to use all these different things. But that was not the main thing I wanted to show you, which is the word arov doesn't necessarily mean insects. That's an interpretation. It's the interpretation that most people follow, but it's not the interpretation that everybody follows, including the Midrash in some sources, and including where Rashi says that it was all types of animals, ones that we wouldn't just call insects. So that could be rodents, it could be serpents, it could be stuff that swarms and goes over the ground. And even to the extent that it might have been land animals, which is why in some translations of the word arov, it does not say insects, it says wild beasts. So you will see that translation used in lots of Haggadot for the word arov. So I'm only telling you this because you may not have heard swarms of insects, because Haggadot throughout the world don't translate arov as insects. It translates in the Haggadah as beasts, wild beasts, as the fourth plague, right? So it goes, blood, frogs, lice, and then wild beasts or insects or swarms of insects. Or some Haggadot just use the word arov, untranslated, or sometimes they'll just say the little asterisk swarms. The only thing we know about the word arov is that it means swarms. That's all that's all the word arov means. It means swarms. So, when I say the word swarms to you, if I said swarm, that this animal is swarm, what would be the animal most likely that you would say if I said swarm?
Bees.
Yeah, bees, right? So we normally think, like, when we use the word swarm, we've already interpreted it as probably an insect, like a bee or a fly. The word arov is also used in Hebrew as a mass of people. So it doesn't have to be bugs, and it could be any kind of animal or any kind of thing. Even people become a swarm. So the word is, I'm only pointing this out because you may never have heard the word insects for this, but this interpretation goes with it. I have no issue with it. I don't think it's necessarily a bad one, but just know that if you ever open your Haggadah and it says in your Haggadah, wild beasts, it's this interpretation that arov was wild beasts, which is a very common interpretation. It's one that it really exists throughout the Midrash commentaries. And again, I don't, the King James went with the flies, which is fine too, but it's clearly something that is not good. And what of course makes it so miraculous is that when you're dealing with swarms and the swarms aren't going to Goshen, then that's really amazing, because it is a mass of something, and that mass is not going to come onto the Israelites. Adonai did so. What was that? What? Oh,
I have a question. I have a question, because I was waiting for it to happen again. It may happen, and I'm sorry if I'm feedbacking, but if you go to Exodus 3, compare it to Exodus 21-ish, someplace around, I was waiting for this, when they were talking about frogs, and Pharaoh spoke to Moses and Aaron, and he said, tell Adonai, right? So tell God, right? And now you just read where Pharaoh says, and go to your God, right? So to me, that's a conflict, right? Because he didn't say at first in Exodus 3-ish, 4-ish, 5, somewhere around there, where Pharaoh said, and tell your God, he said, tell Adonai, right? So tell God.
yep.
I don't know. I caught that. I don't know if anybody else got it.
I'll go back to it. So yeah, that's a great point, right? So plead with Pharaoh, summoned Moses and said, plead with Adonai to remove the frogs from me and my people, and I will let the people go to Adonai. You're absolutely right. So that's in verse 4. It's a great catch, right? So when we look at that kind of difference, look, you could take away from it that what do you take away from it? Like, what do you take away from that?
I guess I take away that he's conflicted himself. that,
Yeah.
he wants to believe his own magicians and his own God, but God is his God too, and he can't maybe handle it. I'm not really sure, and he's so
No,
pissed
no,
off.
I think that's
He's
a
so
great.
pissed off in Exodus 21 that he's saying, "Tell your God to whatever." Right?
Yeah.
So sorry.
No, but I think you're right. And part of what we do when we read the Torah, when we kind of, inhabit the characters, I think everyone's seeing this right here. The main character in this story is Pharaoh. It's not Moses and Aaron. Moses and Aaron are actors in this story, but the vantage point, the person that we're identifying with, because the text identifies the character, is Pharaoh, right? It's Pharaoh's internal monologue that we're hearing throughout this, his turning back and going back and forth and his conflicted nature in it. Moses and Aaron are doing their stuff, but if you were filming this and you're filming it based on what the Torah says, you really have to shift to Pharaoh during these chapters, because it's Pharaoh where at least you have to inhabit his vantage point. You have to get his perspective. So you have to have some of the reaction shots coming from Pharaoh looking at Moses and Aaron, rather than just having Pharaoh be the one that you're seeing through Moses's eyes, but actually that you have Pharaoh, capturing his emotions. You have to, because Moses and Aaron don't really waver. They do their job, they do their thing, and they're almost unidimensional. But Pharaoh, you're absolutely right, is conflicted in it. And what I think, by nature of how we read Torah, we identify with Pharaoh. And that's the weird thing, is that the story, look, we know who the heroes of the story are. We know Pharaoh's not the hero, but what do we take away from this, in our own lives? And I think when we really, you can already see it. You've seen it by the fourth plague. We're definitely supposed to learn about ourselves through how Pharaoh behaves. And this kind of, this idea that when we repeat a mistake over and over again, at some point it goes from, this is absurd, right? And this is why you can come away going, well, God must have made him not do this, because how does somebody keep banging their head against the wall and not see what's doing? And again, we're supposed to take away, how do we do that? How many times do we bang our heads against the wall and go, oh yeah, eventually this wall is going to open, and people are like, no, it's not. There's a solid wall in front of you and you're not getting through it. So this is definitely, we're supposed to take away, how are we like Pharaoh? And the rabbis had no issue, kind of putting that out there for us, because it's so obvious from the text that we're supposed to learn, not to be Pharaoh. But even in, I think the modern interpretations are how are we like Pharaoh? How do we become Pharaoh? And what are the things that we get these messages from God and we don't listen to them? And I think as much as the rabbis didn't want us to identify with Pharaoh and don't want us to be like Pharaoh, they understood there's something to learn here. There's something that we can take away from this and go, oh yeah. How many messages did you get sent? How many warnings did you have for you to change your behavior, and you just didn't do it, right? And that's the lesson for us is, how do we not become like Pharaoh? And a lot of the modern interpretations, the more kind of psychologically inspired and directed interpretations of Torah that people write are very much like this. And I'm saying this because some of the more modern texts that people have written about addictions in particular have focused on the fact that oftentimes people who are in addictive behavior are like this, right? They have so many warnings, they have so many chances, they have so many, like there's so many there's so many times that, God gave them a sign and they just didn't listen, or they couldn't listen, whatever. And that's, that's where a lot of commentaries go with this is people identify, especially again, people who've had compulsive behavior, or who've had, have battled addictions, will just say, hey, I understand what Pharaoh is doing here, because how many times did I get arrested? How many times did I, wind up in the hospital? How many times did I, find myself, living, borrowing money and stealing money from people to feed my addiction, and how many things that I have to have happen to me. And so people, especially, writing about it today have talked about, how our behaviors are very much like Pharaoh. So the conflict that exists with people oftentimes is, it can be pretty deep, where people really do know that they're doing the wrong thing, and they can't help themselves. So I think that that's a real takeaway from this, that people people have today. So thanks, John, for showing that, because Pharaoh's really not sure what to do, and he does seem trapped. So he says, go sacrifice to God within the land, which means, again, you can worship God, but don't leave. And this actually is a practical answer that, like, Pharaoh actually here is coming up with a solution that, they can have their God, and I don't lose my slaves, I don't lose my workers. And, maybe that's a solution, right? But Moses replied, it would not be right to do this, for what we sacrifice to our God Adonai is untouchable to the Egyptians. If we sacrifice that which is untouchable to the Egyptians before their very eyes, will they not stone us? So we must go a distance of 3 days into the wilderness and sacrifice to Adonai as our God commanded us. So Moses' answer is, we can't do that. It doesn't work, because, we make sacrifices that, they're taboo animals here in Egypt. You'll get mad at us. It'll create this terrible friction. So we can't do that. Which, Moses' answer there is kind of, it's kind of, as we say in Yiddish, it's kind of fumfering, because, like, that's not what I told you. God didn't say, tell Pharaoh that. Moses comes up with almost an excuse for why they can't do that. Maybe he thought that was an answer. I mean, look, he knows what the end objective is. What was the objective by saying this to Pharaoh? Hey, if we get out 3 days, then we don't have to have any more plagues, and then we can run away because we'll be 3 days away. I mean, that's where most people would go with it, other than the fact that we've already been told that the firstborn have to die. And we're not even close to that yet. We're a third of the way into that, or almost halfway into that. But that's not manifest yet. And so what does he do? He has to give him an answer for why that's not going to work, because Pharaoh's come up with a solution, and Moses has to come up with an answer of why that solution isn't going to work. So he does. He gives him an answer. He says, that's not going to work. We've got to go 3 days away, which, by the way, like 1 day away, 2 days away, no, 3 days away, which, again, to some extent, he's also telegraphing to Pharaoh, we're not coming back. So he's also basically saying to Pharaoh, yeah, maybe we aren't going to come back, and keep that in your mind. So he doesn't say no, but he says, this is why we can't do it. He doesn't say God said no, this is what we're doing. He says, well, this is why this won't work. Pharaoh said, I will let you go to sacrifice to your God Adonai in the wilderness, but do not go very far. Plead then with me, for me. So that's the backing back to right here. Pharaoh is saying, I will let you go to sacrifice to your God Adonai. And here he uses the words God and Adonai, but do not go very far. And then he says, plead then for me, which is interesting, which kind of his mind, he's saying, well, maybe if they pray, they can throw a little prayer in for me. So Pharaoh's response to Moses's bargaining, right, is okay, fine. He gives in. That's what he says. He says, I will let you go. But then he says, do not go very far. So you can leave the land, but just don't go that far. And Moses said, when I leave your presence, I will plead with Adonai that the swarms of insects depart tomorrow from Pharaoh and his courtiers and his people. But let not Pharaoh again act deceitfully, not letting the people go to Adonai. So Moses says, okay, I'll go plead for you for the swarms to be gone. And from the Egyptians, your people, right? His people, not our people. This plague's not affecting us. But don't go back on your word. Now, again, assumedly, Moses knows he's going to go back on his word, and he sets Pharaoh up by warning him and saying, don't do it. Don't do it. So the agreement is actually in place right now. Right now, they have an agreement. They have an agreement. So Moses left Pharaoh's presence and pleaded with Adonai. And Adonai did as Moses asked, removing the swarms of insects or the swarms from Pharaoh and from his courtiers and from his people. Not one remained. So miracle again, right away, it's gone. It's not just that they, over time they left, gone the next day. So the miracle is even more miraculous because they left as soon as they were as miraculous as they came, their leaving was miraculous. Remember, the frogs all died, and they died quick, but they still were there. They're gone. The insects are, the swarms are out. But Pharaoh became stubborn this time also and would not let the people go. And there's the word kibed, the stubbornness. Now, here it also says, when it says stubborn, it doesn't say that God made him stubborn. Again, doesn't have to necessarily, but it doesn't say the words that God hardened his heart. It said that Pharaoh was stubborn. That's what it says. It doesn't say God made Pharaoh stubborn. It says that Pharaoh was stubborn and he changed his mind. So agreement is in place and he goes back on it. And Moses warned him not to do it. Moses said, don't do it. That's the end of chapter 8. So we've now gone through 4 plagues. We've seen different reactions from Pharaoh. We've seen the plagues come from different parts of the world, as it will. Remember, we've talked about this before in the biblical ecosystem, if you will. There are 3 areas. There are 3 regions of the cosmos or of the earth, the universe, for them, for us, as they knew the world. The waters, the earth, and the air. Those are the 3 realms. Water, earth, air. So far, the earth brought back the last 2 plagues, the water, the first 2 plagues. Two plagues from the earth. Because the swarms, according to this, that's why I don't love the insects the way it says insects. Well, I don't know that I mean, insects, because they fly a lot of these are flying. That's kind of maybe why they don't like to use the word of insects, because it wouldn't include scorpions, or in some people's minds it would include cockroaches and things like that, but not most of the things we think of swarms would be flying things. So anyways, it definitely seems like this second plague is also more earthbound swarms, which is why sometimes they use wild beasts, because none of those wild beasts were flying wild beasts. So chapter 9 begins, and we'll probably, as you can see, we're not going to get through all the plagues, but we're going to get through, you'll see I'm going to get to a point where it makes sense. I really wanted to get through, it'd be good to get through all the plagues since we're going to be breaking for a couple of weeks, but let's see we'll see. It was about a half hour. So Adonai said to Moses, go to Pharaoh and say to him, thus says Adonai, the God of Hebrews, let my people go worship me. For if you refuse to let them go and continue to hold them, then the hand of the Lord will strike your livestock in the fields, the horses, the asses, the camels, the cattle, and the sheep, with a very severe pestilence. But Adonai will make a distinction between the livestock of Israel and the livestock of the Egyptians, so that nothing shall die of that belongs to the Israelites. Adonai has fixed the time tomorrow. Adonai will do this thing in the land. So this is the fifth plague. This is the fifth plague, the plague of pestilence. Right? This is the fifth plague. And the word that we have in Hebrew is dever. Now, the reason that the chapter 9 begins with this plague, why there's this break here, is there seems to be almost a different sense here with this, which is that there is a almost not a restart, but like that something is happening here, which is not which is a little different than the way that it's been propositioned up until now, and that something like there's something here which is now well, there's a voice, there's a repetition of this idea of the voice that's coming against them right now. And well, let's take a look at why there would be this distinction. So again, there's a distinction between the Israelites and the Egyptians. There's also this understanding that this plague is going to be a disease. The word dever is a plague or pestilence, and that this is going to affect the animals. And it's a serious deal, because this is affecting their animals or their livestock, right? Which we would understand to be one of their food sources, but even more so, it's their transportation, right? Because if their camels are being affected, if the asses are being affected, these are the way they transport supplies throughout their country. Horses are the basis not only for their supplies, but also for their warfare. As we know, the Egyptians had horses and chariots. It says over and over again. The last couple of things here, the cattle and the sheep, are interesting, because one of the things we know about the Egyptians, and we already kind of heard this in the last chapter, they worship sheep. They actually venerate sheep as one of the manifestations of their god Amun-Ra. So is this not also somehow connected to the things that they worship? Their god Hathor is a cattle god. So, there's also levels to this that are theological for them. So it's all livestock. Again, for the Egyptians, we know that in some cases, these are animals that they venerated, that they worshiped, that they wouldn't kill. And now those animals are going to be killed as well. So this is not just the plague that's killing animals, it's affecting their basic infrastructure of their transportation, of their commerce, and again, possibly their gods. if these animals are raised as not for offerings to the gods, but literally like as gods themselves, like the way, some Hindu traditions worship, venerate, certain types of cows. This is a pretty serious deal. And it is. I mean, the fifth plague for us is considered to be like a watershed moment in a lot of ways, because of how devastating this is now to the people. Because this is not an inconvenience anymore. This isn't a, well, for a few days we had a problem. This is going to be devastating, because once the cow is dead, once the horse is dead, it takes years to replace, and it's very, very expensive. So this is a huge blow to their economic vitality, the Egyptians. This is huge. But Adonai will make a distinction, right? And so this is the other part of this. So on Adonai did the very next day, all the livestock of the Egyptians died, but of the livestock of the Israelites, not a beast died. And when Pharaoh inquired, he found out that not a head of the livestock of Israel had died. Yet Pharaoh remained stubborn, and he would not let the people go. So here, the plague happens. Pharaoh doesn't even have a moment on what he's doing with this. This plague seems to have triggered an immediate response in him that he is not going to do it. And what's amazing, there's not a negotiation here at this point. Pharaoh just flips out. And again, what makes Pharaoh so crazed is not just that the plague happened, but that it didn't affect the Israelites, right? Because he inquires and he finds out that the livestock of Israel hadn't died. Now that doesn't make any sense, because a plague that hits animals was common in the ancient world. It's common in this world. If you talk to farmers that raise livestock, this is the biggest nightmare that they have. That they'll have an infection of disease that will spread through their livestock. Because there's no way to stop one cow from getting sick once the other cow next to it got sick. It's almost a guarantee that it's gonna hit all of them. And you're gonna have to wipe out everything. And in many cases, they just prevent it. They'll just wipe out a whole herd. So this is a huge, this is a problem for Pharaoh. It's a tremendous devastation for the Egyptians. But the effect is almost so strong on Pharaoh that he doesn't even want to consider the option. Adonai said to Moses and Aaron, each of you take soot, handfuls of soot from the kiln, and let Moses throw it in the sky in the sight of Pharaoh. Now, what happened here is the fifth plague happened, and all of a sudden you're in the sixth plague. There's no remittance of the plague. There's no ask God to make the plague stop. It's over. The pestilence hits. There's no calling it back. There's no recall. There's no, we'll get rid of. No, it runs through the livestock. The livestock died. And here it says all the livestock died, by the way. It doesn't say that, most of them died. It says they all died. I mean, that would just be unbelievable. It would be devastating. By the way, I will tell you, there's an interesting midrash on this, that if the only people who have livestock now the next day are the Israelites, they now have cornered the market on livestock. And so the Israelites have every animal left, which is a problem. Now, first of all, by the way, if they were slaves and they had livestock, it kind of goes against our understanding of what a slave was. But clearly, they lived as slaves with their families. They were able to maintain their own livestock because they had livestock. And their livestock is now the only livestock left in Egypt. So you can imagine that the Israelites are now, were they taken away? What happened? Wouldn't Pharaoh just impound all the Israelite livestock? That's a possibility as well. just took it away. It's a pretty wild situation though for Pharaoh, that this fifth plague, his reaction is like, he doesn't even have a reaction. He can't do anything. So notice this next plague: take handfuls of soot from the kiln and let Moses throw it towards the sky in the sight of Pharaoh. So this is Moses. Now Moses and Aaron are there, but now Moses is the one who's going to be the active participant in this. He's the one who's going to throw it towards the sky in the sight of Pharaoh. So take handfuls of soot from the kiln. So go to the oven, take some soot out, throw it into the sky in the sight of Pharaoh. It shall become fine dust all over the land of Egypt and cause an inflammation breaking out in boils on human and beasts throughout the land of Egypt. Now you can wonder, well, how did the beasts get back in Egypt if they just got hit by this plague? Right? Right? It's a possibility.
Well, could those be wild beasts instead of the tamed?
Could be, but most people wouldn't care if a wild wolf
Yeah.
or whatever had
Right, boils.
boils. There's a possibility. That, and this is the first time I'm going to tell you this today, and it's almost over. So I'm going to tell you, there's a reason why I waited till the end to tell you this. This is one of the first and most obvious indications here that there's two plague stories that got woven together. Because in the last plague that we just read, nowhere does it even say that Moses and Aaron do the plague.
Mm-hmm.
And in the next plague, it says that Moses and Aaron were there and they created a plague that affected the boils on humans and beasts. Now, look, we all talk about the plague of boils. Doesn't that plague? It's a bad plague. This is the first plague that actually, by the way, that affects the human body, right? Because the other plagues affected the earth, animals. It's external things. Right now, it's actually hitting the body, right? So, the insects might have crawled on you and made you uncomfortable, but this is actually now your body. This is actually a plague that's affecting the human body. What's interesting about this, folks, is that this is a little indication that this is a different author at play. Because if the previous author had written that there was livestock that were affected, and now the livestock are there getting boils, where did they come from? Now, of course, the rabbis didn't want to go there, so they had a great midrash that's very old, which is that, yes, indeed, the Israelites had these animals, and so they got taken away by Pharaoh, or he bought them from them at a very high price because they're the only people that have animals now in the land of Egypt. All those are possibilities, but that the beasts that got hit were those beasts that survived by being owned by the Israelites. It's a possibility. It's also a possibility that there's now another author that's been going back and forth with the plagues, and that explains why in some cases the plagues involve Moses and Aaron, and sometimes it doesn't really seem to be Moses and Aaron, and that the plagues sometimes have Pharaoh calling them back, and then sometimes they don't. It's all possibilities. But again, what becomes glaring here is that it only becomes glaring because I pointed it out, but there is an issue here, which is that the beasts also got hit by the boils. But that's what it
Cool.
says.
Hey, Mark, Rabbi.
Yeah.
My version here is talking about the livestock that were just left out in the fields were the ones that were plagued, but the ones that were protected, let's see, it says the protected livestock remained alive. So probably the second, the next one with the boils breaking out were the one to hit those animals.
Yeah, which would have been animals that were either the ones the Israelites took care of. There's an interesting midrash too, which that might be alluding to, an interpretation that the rabbis had a long time ago, which was that some Egyptians knowing that this plague was about to hit, let the Israelites look after their animals and then took them back. Those are all possibilities, because look, the bottom line is the word that's used here. And again, I don't want to dwell on the animal, but because the word that's used here is a behemah, and behemoth is usually used for domesticated animals. Usually, a behemah is usually, it's actually, by the way, the root of the English word behemoth. But usually behemoth are things like cattle and horses and ruminants and animals that we normally would domesticate or use, and not specifically wild animals. So that's why it generally wouldn't be, and translated as human and beast. What is your translation use for the word beast? Glory? What's the translation?
Looking, hold on. You know what? I don't know. I'd have to look
In
back
verse
and
9,
see.
does it say in verse 9?
Verse 9. I don't think it correlates the same.
Oh, it's a different verse. So Mary, what does the King James say for human and beast?
Man and beast.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, beast definitely has more of a connotation of wild beasts, but I think, a good translation is, look, I'm gonna, since we have it, I'll show you the commentary on it. So let's see what Rashi says. No, Rashi doesn't have the beast part. Let's see if, no, let's see if any of Ibn Ezra's is. No, hold it a second. Let me just see if maybe I didn't hit. Nope. Ibn Ezra and Rashi don't have it. Most of the other commentaries do not have. Yeah, the commentaries aren't even dealing with why the animals got it, because it is a little bit of a problem. I mean, it's a textual problem of why this goes. And again, look, to me, part of what makes it more understandable is that, if the author didn't, if there's a different author's voice coming through here, he didn't think about, that issue. He wasn't thinking about the Dever plague. He wasn't thinking about that, the fifth plague. He was thinking about, I'll show you when we're done, which plagues were according to which author, but, it just, you don't have to, I mean, he wouldn't have had to deal with that. He didn't have that as a plague. Look, the rabbis, actually, the commentaries I showed you really takes place out of the way that he did this, which is that he throws up soot from the. I mean, that's like really powerful, that he takes this soot and throws it up in the air. So they took the soot of the kiln, appeared before Pharaoh. Moses threw it towards the sky, and it caused an inflammation breaking out in boils on human and beast. The magician priests were unable to confront Moses because of the inflammation, for the inflammation afflicted the magician priests as well as the other Egyptians. So what's interesting about this is that we went back to the magicians and said that these guys who knew how to fix anything, they couldn't even do anything because they were too sick with the plague, right? So it is funny that they got hit like everybody else. Their skills did not make them immune from this plague, which again is saying that at least this issue of the Egyptians, which we didn't have in the last, we didn't have it on every plague, was whether the magician priests are in the picture. And here they come back in the picture. So that also might be part of, again, a little bit of an indicator of which voice it is that's telling us these stories of the plagues. And again, Adonai stiffened the heart of Pharaoh, and he would not heed them, just as Adonai had told Moses. So that's the bottom line off of that one too, which is that there is no negotiation. Adonai said to Moses, early in the morning, present yourself to Pharaoh and say to him, thus says Adonai, the God of Hebrews, let my people go to worship me. Now we always just say, let my people go. We don't do the other part, which is let my people go to worship me. But that's what is actually what the whole phrase is. Let my people go and worship me. It's not just let them go free, but let them go to worship me. So that's part of it, which, by the way, we didn't talk about this issue at all, but Pharaoh wants to be worshiped as a god. He expected to be worshiped as a god. And what's happening this whole time is that Moses is telling them, is telling Pharaoh, no, we worship God. And we're not going to worship you. They're going to worship Adonai. They're not going to worship your Egyptian gods. They're not going to worship you. They're going to worship God. So again, this distinction is really powerful. And here is another warning of what's going to happen, which again, we saw sometimes we have and sometimes we don't have. For this time, I will send all my plagues upon your person and your courtiers and your people, in order that you may know that there is none like me in the world. I could have stretched out forth my hand and stricken you and your people with pestilence, and you would have been effaced from the earth. Wow. So we forget that line's actually in the Torah.
Yeah, I forgot that.
Right? That
Mhm.
Pharaoh actually is warned that God could have just wiped you. You could have been gone already.
Mhm.
Like that was on the table. You could have been wiped out from the earth. With pestilence, with a dever, with a plague that would have killed you. The plague killed the livestock. Could have been a plague to kill you. And that's what's interesting about that fifth plague, because it's the same word that's used there. The dever, the fifth plague could have been you. You could have been dead then. So the same way that I did that could have been you, which is important because that's the setup for the 10th plague. Now, again, you could say the 5th and 10th, that's great symmetry. But again, it also could be that the writer of this is telling you that's what the 10th plague will be, however many plagues, you go back and forth between them. The warning here is there is death on the table. There's death on the table. These other things that we've been doing could have been you dead already. Nevertheless, I have spared you for this purpose, in order to show you my power and in order that my fame may resound throughout the world. Yet you continue to thwart my people and you do not let them go. This time tomorrow, I will rain down a very heavy hail, such as not been in Egypt from the day that it was founded until now, which is thousands of years already. So you're going to be hit with the next plague, the plague of hail. Therefore, order your livestock. Well, they have livestock again. There it's quite clear that they have livestock. This is the animals that are in your fields. And everything in the open brought under shelter, every human and beast that is found outside, not having been brought indoors, shall perish when the hail comes down upon them. Those among Pharaoh's courtiers who feared Adonai's word brought their slaves and livestock indoors to safety, but those who paid no regard to the word of Adonai left their slaves and livestock out in the open. And so here we see something also different by this plague,
Mhm.
which is that the Egyptian people had a choice. They could have now done the right thing. And some of them did. Some of the Egyptians said, yeah, I get it. This is a God that actually is powerful. This is a God who actually exists. And so Moses said, God is doing this so that you understand that there's a God. And that is a lesson for the Egyptians too. It's definitely for the Israelites. It's now also very clear that the plagues, and look, we've seen it from the beginning. He said that you will know. Moses and Aaron have been saying it all along to Pharaoh, that you're going to know that God is real. And now the Egyptians are now given the opportunity to do this. So again, no question that they have livestock by this point. And livestock doesn't grow overnight. So there was not a bunch of baby cows that grew in that time. So brought them indoors if they believed. And Adonai said to Moses, and here it is, Moses, not Moses and Aaron, Moses, hold out your arm toward the sky that hail may fall on the land of Egypt, upon human and beast and all the grasses of the field in the land of Egypt. So Moses held out his rod toward the sky, and Adonai sent thunder and hail, and fire streamed down to the ground, as Adonai rained down hail upon the land of Egypt. And so that is not just a thunder and hail, but fire. And that's where we get the fire and brimstone.
Oh,
That there is a hail that is not just cold pellets of water. This is fire. And this is coming down on the ground. Some people say it sounds like a meteor shower. It sounds like, stuff coming from the sky. It's definitely on fire. And this plague of Barad is very, very serious because it will kill whatever's on the ground. The hail was very heavy, fire flashing in the midst of hail, such as has not fallen on the land of Egypt since it became a nation. Throughout the land of Egypt, the hail struck down all that were in the open, both human and beast. The hail also struck down all the grasses of the field and shattered all the trees of the field. So this is affecting all of nature. It's affecting flora and fauna and people who were outside. Only in the region of Goshen, where the Israelites were, where there was no hail. So the Israelites, or at least the mass community of Israelites that lived in that area, they didn't have it. Goshen again is spared. There's a distinction that's made. Thereupon Pharaoh sent for Moses and Aaron and said to them, I stand guilty this time. Adonai is in the right, and I and my people are in the wrong. Wow. Plead with Adonai that there may be an end of God's thunder and of hail. And here he says, plead with Adonai that there be an end of God's thunder and hail. I will let you go. You need stay no longer. And there it's not.
And there it is. Sorry to interrupt, but there it is again. It's not your God, right?
it's just God.
Here,
It's just God.
very
And
clear.
You're right.
Exactly. And he uses both words. He uses Adonai, and this is God. So Pharaoh seems to have finally gotten it. Pharaoh finally got it. But of course, this is only plague 8. It's not over. But Pharaoh has changed. Something in him has changed because now he's recognizing that it's God. He says, I will let you go. And he doesn't say, you got to stay close by. You have to stay in the land. You need to stay no longer. Kind of is like, I give up. You can go wherever you want. You can do whatever you need to do. So Pharaoh has now given up. Moses said to him, as I go out of the city, I shall spread out my hands to Adonai. The thunder will cease and the hail will fall no more, so that you may know that the earth is Adonai's. And so there it's very clear. It's not the God of the Israelites. It's the God of all the earth. Ki Adonai haaretz. You will know that God is the God of the earth, of the world. But I know that you and your courtiers do not fear God, Adonai. There's the words together, Adonai Elohim.
Mhm.
I know you don't understand this God. We know you don't understand it. You do not fear God yet. Maybe you'd say, well, they definitely fear God, but they don't have awe of God. They don't have wonder of God. Maybe they're just fearing God, but they don't understand God. And that's why the word yirah has a sense of more of just fear, but of awe, of respect. Now the flax and barley were ruined, for the barley was in the ear and the flax was in the bud, but the wheat and the emmer were not hurt. They ripened late. So this is an important idea of when this happened. It happened during the harvest, but at least the harvest, the early harvest, which is the barley harvest, which is the harvest that usually was around April and May. It's the harvest that we actually celebrate at Passover, interestingly, which means that this happened around now Passover time. We know we're getting close. The wheat comes later. We're going to read a little bit more because we're almost there. So the wheat was not hit by this. Leaving Pharaoh, Moses went outside the city and spread out his hands to Adonai, and the thunder and the hail ceased, and no rain came pouring down upon the earth. But when Pharaoh saw that the rain and the hail and the thunder had ceased, he became stubborn and reverted to his guilty ways, as did his courtiers. So Pharaoh's heart was stiffened. There it is, Vayichazek, the word chazak, and he would not let the Israelites go, just as Adonai had foretold Moses through Moses. Moses, again, knew it. He said it. He went back to his translation here as the guilty ways. He continued to transgress. Chet, the word we used at high holidays, chet shachatanu, the sin that we've committed. And again, the yakabed libo, we have the stubbornness again. He became stubborn, by the way. It doesn't say that God did it. It says he became stubborn.
Mhm.
It was not from the outside. And so here's the beginning of 10. Now, this is interesting because this is the beginning of another Torah portion. So we actually read through one Torah portion. And again, we went a little bit, well, I don't think we went too fast, but we went through the plagues. And I wanted you to see when we get right up to this plague. Then Adonai said to Moses, go to Pharaoh, for I have hardened his heart and the hearts of his courtiers, in order that I may display these my signs among them. And again, we've gone back to that, where I've hardened his heart, where God says to Moses, I have hardened his heart. And I did it so that these would, same words, I may display, I may show him what is my power. And that you may recount, and this is now the first time that we've had this, in the hearing of your child and of your child's child, your grandchildren, how I made a mockery of the Egyptians and how I displayed my signs among them, in order that you may know that I am Adonai. And here is the kicker that we finally heard now after the 8th plague. This is not just so the Egyptians will know it, but this is so that you, your children, and your grandchildren will talk about what I did. And that is why thousands of years later,
We're
we
still
still
doing
talk
it.
about plagues. And that's why every year at Passover, we go through those plagues and we recount them and we talk about how this was a manifestation of God for the Egyptians and for us. And so that your children and your grandchildren and great-grandchildren and so on will know that I'm God. And so Moses and Aaron went to Pharaoh and said to him, thus says Adonai, the God of Hebrews, how long will you refuse to humble yourself before me? Let my people go that they may worship me. This is what God has said. For if you refuse to let my people go, tomorrow I will bring locusts on your territory. They shall cover the land so that no one will be able to see the land, so that they may devour the surviving remnant that was left to you after the hail. That they shall eat away the trees that grow in the field. And so this is the 8th plague, is the plague of locusts. This is the plague that for the first time with the 7th and 8th plagues, the plagues actually are said to be connected. So if there's any question of who wrote this or who put this together, this is the first time that the plagues literally have said, this last plague was bad, and this next plague is going to hit you where it's going to finish the job of what the last plague didn't do. So the surviving remnant, which you already heard, was the wheat and the stuff that was, the wheat that was the late harvest, the emmer and the wheat, the good, and that's, by the way, the good stuff. The barley is like the raw material for most of the bread, and it's the basic bread, right? It's the cheaper bread, it's the cheaper grain, the barley. But now your really good stuff is going to get wiped out. And so this is a 1-2 punch. Now look, we heard that the plague of Dever, the pestilence, could have been human, which is key because that also is sitting the as I said, for the 10th plague, for the plague of the death of the firstborn. But these 2 plagues, I like to say, is the 1-2 punch of hail and then locusts. And it's both are going to be hit as if to say, wow, you want to see how the plagues manifest on top of each other, the exponential power and this is where we're going to finish, the plague of locusts,
Mhm.
because this is a plague that, again, we haven't dealt with and we don't deal with because we don't live in Africa and parts of the world that get affected by locusts. Though it's really important in this last Jurassic Park movie that just came out, because they have locusts in it, which is nothing compared to dinosaurs, but anyways, it's in the movie. But locusts are in the new Jurassic Park movie as a you get to see locusts do their thing. It is a scary thing to see. I mean, we see it, because now we can get video of a film of what locusts do, but it is insane to see the locusts what they'll do to fields. And there again, they're warned about it. They're told, as they said in this case, that it's based on the previous plague. Now you're going to get hit with this plague. Moreover, they shall fill your palaces and the houses of your courtiers and all the Egyptians, something that neither your fathers nor your fathers' fathers have seen from this day they appeared on the earth to this day. And with that, he left Pharaoh's presence. And so what's interesting about this is, again, just as we had this, that your descendants will know about these plagues, we also have, and this is like nothing you've ever seen in the past.
Mhm.
And that's also looking backwards and looking forwards. So interesting with the Egyptians, they say, you haven't seen anything like this in your past. And what's interesting is it's juxtaposed with the Israelites being the people of the future. So the Egyptians were worshiped, were recognized. Everybody knew the Egyptians had this amazing history. Moses knew it. Every Israelite knew that the Pharaoh is going back generations. There's this dynasty and this power of the Egyptian history. Yeah, you've never seen anything like this in your history, which is really important. But what we say is we're going to be talking about this in our history, because you guys are the people of the past. We're going to be the people of the future.
Mhm.
We'll still be here. Your stuff will long be ruins, and it is. We'll walk around Egypt and you'll see some amazing stuff. If you ever get to walk through Egypt, which I thankfully did when it was a safer place to go to, got to walk around Luxor and Aswan,
Mhm.
go through those places. It's amazing to see, but it's ancient history. It's ancient history. And it was ancient history then too, as I told you. Some of these places have been around for 2,000 years by the time that Moses would have even been saying this. So they leave Pharaoh's presence, and Pharaoh's courtiers now say to Pharaoh, how long shall this one be a snare to us? Let a delegation go to worship God Adonai. And here they talk about God by God's name. Are you not yet aware that Egypt is lost? So for the first time now, Pharaoh's own people are turning on him. His inner circle says, you got to let these people go. They confront him finally. It literally takes 7 full plagues for this to happen. But they finally say, in between the hail and the locusts, just Pharaoh, stop. Somebody finally has the courage to say to him, you're wrong. So Moses and Aaron were brought back to Pharaoh, and he said to them, go worship God Adonai. Who are the ones to go? And Moses replied, we all go, regardless of social station, meaning again, young and old. We will go with our sons and our daughters, our flocks and herds, for we must observe Adonai's festival. Now that's a pretty bold thing to say, which is everyone's going to go and everything's going to go. We're taking our flocks and herds with us. Now, we already heard that's so he can sacrifice them, but it's also kind of a weird thing to say, we're leaving and we're taking everything with us when we go to this special worship. He's basically saying to Pharaoh, yeah, we're all going. And yeah, we might, take it for what it's worth. We might not come back because we're taking everything with us when we go. So this is going to freak Pharaoh out. But he said to them, Adonai be with you. The same as I mean to let your dependents go with you. Clearly you are bent on mischief. So Pharaoh literally says, yeah, sure. Yeah, right. You're really going to come back. No, you gentlemen go and worship Adonai, since that is what you want. And they were expelled from Pharaoh's presence. So he basically says, yeah, fine. My people tell me I'm supposed to let you guys go. I'll let you go, but no one else is going. And so Pharaoh thinks, yeah, fine, I'll kick them out. And that's what it literally says. He expelled them from Pharaoh's presence. Then Adonai said to Moses, hold out your arm over the land of Egypt for the locusts, that they may come upon the land of Egypt and eat up all the grasses in the land and whatever the hail has left. And so there it's very clear that the 2 plagues, 7 and 8, are connected. And Moses held out his rod over the land of Egypt, And Adonai drove an east wind over the land all that day and night. And when the morning came, the east wind had brought locusts. And locusts invaded all the land of Egypt and settled within all the territory of Egypt in a thick mass. Never before had there been so many. So they happen in Egypt, but not like this, nor will there ever be so many again. And they hid all the land from view, and all the land was darkened. And they ate up all the grasses of the field and all the fruits of the trees which the hail had left, so that there was nothing left of tree, of grass, or field in all the land of Egypt. So this is a plague that destroys all of the flora of Egypt. The fruit trees, the fields, the grass, the wheat, everything is gone. There's nothing left. The trees are stripped barren.
So there's
so
no
there-
food.
There's no food, there's no grass, there's no trees.
Wow.
Everything is gone. Pharaoh hurriedly summoned Moses and Aaron and said, I stand guilty before your God Adonai and before you. And now he said again, I'm
Your
guilty.
God.
I'm guilty, right? Your God Adonai and before you. Forgive my offense just this once, and plead with your God Adonai that this death but be removed from me. So he left Pharaoh's presence and he pleaded with Adonai. And Adonai caused a shift to a very strong west wind, which lifted the locusts and hurled them into the Sea of Reeds. Not a single locust remained in the territory of Egypt. So this is another miracle in that they all got blown out, all of them. But folks, what did you just see? Where did those locusts get blown into?
The Red Sea, the Sea of Reeds.
The same place and the same words. They will be hurled into Yam Suf. This is the same place where Pharaoh and his chariots will be hurled into the Sea of Reeds. So the foreshadowing of that is very, very, very strong.
Wow.
And of course, what's very strong about this buildup, and again, this is where the Torah is so powerful in its language, its imagery, is just as when the Torah says that the winds blew all night when the Red Sea split, it did so with the locusts, and the wind is part of the experience of the plague.
Mhm.
And we're going to finish with this. And Adonai stiffened Pharaoh's heart, and he would not let the Israelites go. And this is the end of the eighth plague. And so when we come back and we return in a few weeks, we'll read the last two plagues. You saw some of what happens with the plagues and why we kind of wanted to read them together as a way of comparing and contrasting the way the plagues kind of go down. You can see the totality of the plagues. How long did it take between the plagues? We don't know for sure, but it didn't happen over a very long time. It wasn't like it took years and years for these plagues to happen. They happened very, very quickly, which again, to some extent, is a constant body blow to the Egyptians. It's constantly, and as you saw from the commentary, Rashi, that it's part of like when you go to war, you don't just do one thing. You hit people constantly. And nowadays we have psychological warfare, which we understand to be not just loud noises, but pamphlets and propaganda and all the kinds of things that we do. That's what the sounds of the frogs were, the trumpets. But this idea of hitting somebody constantly and in all different spheres, you don't let them have the water, but you also don't let the animals live, and you take away everything from them, so that again there is there's you don't hold back, and you have to literally wage war against your enemy, and that's what happens. That was Rashi's commentary on it. But however you look at it, there's a totality of the earth, the water, the air, everything turning on the Egyptians, and there is no place for them to hide. They can't hide in the water, they can't hide in the air, they can't hide in the ground. Every atmosphere has been taken away, every biosphere has been taken away from them, so there's no place to hide, which must have just been the trauma of being an Egyptian during this time, it was overwhelming. And you know, this is a good chunk, as you can see, of the story of Moses, is this interaction. But as you also see, the vantage point and where we see a lot of the drama happening is within Pharaoh himself, and within the Egyptian sphere, which again, it doesn't surprise us, because Pharaoh, and we've been warned, and Moses was told that this is for the Egyptians also. This isn't just for us to talk about, it's for the Egyptians to learn from. And so most of the action here takes place in Egypt. It takes place specifically, if you will, in Pharaoh's own house. And Pharaoh, if you're filming this, most of this is going on in from Pharaoh's vantage point, and within the conversations and the dialogue between Moses and Aaron and Pharaoh. So you'd cut away to scenes of what's happening in Goshen, or what's not happening in Goshen, what's happening in the streets of the Egyptians where they're living, or along the Nile. All those things would be happening, but so much of the activity, so much of the text is actually in Pharaoh's own house, in Pharaoh's own head. So this is part of what, when you see it in the text, what really is happening here, which again, it's, we create it every year at Passover, and it's probably, I think to some extent, it's like one of the most powerful parts of the Seder, is taking out our juice, our wine, when we say each one of the plagues, when we recount the plagues.
Mhm.
It's such a powerful ritual, right? It's a ritual of food. It's a ritual, where we're using the wine, where we're actually, each one of us is recounting these plagues. But and it's a focal point, a moment in the Seder. But again, now when you read the plagues, next time you're at Passover, you'll probably have it'll have a different meaning to you. The connotations and the feelings of what's going on is there. But again, every time we do that activity, we're fulfilling the biblical promise that your children and grandchildren and the descendants in the future will remember these plagues. And we do, and we recount them as a testament to this experience of what it meant to live in Egypt, and what it meant to be eventually freed. So everybody, please stay healthy. Hope everybody is going to enjoy some summer over the next couple of weeks. When we get back in a few weeks, I hope to see, hopefully everyone will be here again for us to finish up the plagues, and to the next week, the next time we get together in a couple of weeks, we're going to read the next reading. We'll be reading about those last plagues, and it's wrapped around the first Passover, because in the midst of the plagues, or the last plague, is the Passover, the first Passover meal. So that's what happens in the next chapters. It's not just the plagues, but now we're actually going to see how that was our Passover experience, the first Passover experience. So everybody stay healthy and stay happy, and hopefully enjoy some summer.
Have a
Take care.
wonderful
Take
trip.
care, everybody.
Have a
Thank you.
fabulous trip.
Safe travels.
Wish you the
Thank
best.
you, everybody.
Safe
Thank
travels.
you.
Thanks. It's great to see you. Thanks.